I'll just output the rewritten script directly instead of saving to a file." The vial sat on the stainless steel counter when Sandra Beaumont walked into the quality lab and told the assembled room that Victor Aldren had just jeopardized an $890 million federal contract over a paperwork problem that any competent manager could have resolved before lunch. She picked up the hold notice he had placed on the entire Cardivex production batch, tore it in half, and dropped both pieces into the waste bin beside his workstation. Then she told him he was fired, effective immediately, and asked security to escort him out before the hospital consortium representatives. Waiting the conference room upstairs had any reason to wonder why the building's quality division appeared to be in conflict with itself. Victor Aldren did not argue. He asked only that someone log the exact time and the name of the person who had authorized the release. Nobody moved to do that, so he logged it himself in his own handwriting on the copy of the hold notice he had already placed in his personal certification file. He sealed the original API sample inside a tamper-evident evidence bag, signed the chain of custody label, and walked out through the same side entrance he had used every morning for 11 years. 48 hours later, the FDA received an external safety report bearing his name and a reference number that routed it directly to the compliance division responsible for pharmaceutical contracts with federal hospital systems. By the end of that week, the $890 million supply agreement that Sandra Beaumont had spent 3 years negotiating was placed under immediate regulatory review, and nobody inside Beaumont Herrick Pharmaceuticals could explain to the people who needed answers. Most why the hold had originated from a quality report that their own executive team had physically destroyed. Before that single-flagged vial unravels everything Sandra Beaumont built, subscribe to Secret Past so you don't miss 1 second of what happens next. Beaumont Herrick Pharmaceuticals had been manufacturing cardiovascular medications out of a campus of low beige buildings on the edge of Raleigh, North Carolina for 22 years, and the week everything changed was supposed to be the company's finest. The firm had won conditional approval to supply Cardivex, its flagship beta blocker, to the Federal Veterans Health Administration under a 5-year exclusive contract worth $890 million. The agreement required a final pre-shipment audit confirming that the manufacturing process, ingredient sourcing, and internal quality documentation all met FDA standards for drugs dispensed to patients with complex cardiac histories. Sandra had invited the VHA Consortium's procurement officers to tour the facility on the same day the audit was scheduled to conclude, a decision that said everything about how certain she was that nothing would go wrong. Victor Aldren had been the senior quality assurance chemist at Beaumont Herrick for 11 years, though most of the executive floor only ever thought of him as the quiet man who ran the holding reports and occasionally slowed things down near quarter's end. What they didn't know, because Victor had never mentioned it and nobody had ever thought to ask, was that he'd spent the 7 years before joining the company as a validation specialist at the FDA's Office of Pharmaceutical Quality, where he'd personally written sections of the compliance framework that manufacturers like Beaumont Herrick were required to follow. He'd left that position after his wife, Clara, was diagnosed with the autoimmune condition that would eventually take her life, choosing a private sector role with predictable hours so he could be home reliably every evening for their son, Nathan. After Clara died, the predictable hours became the scaffolding around which he organized everything else. He never asked for special treatment because of any of it. He simply came in each morning, did the work at the level the work required, and went home. His standard on every batch release was the same one he'd always kept. A drug does not become safe simply because the person with the biggest title decided the schedule couldn't accommodate a delay. On the Tuesday before the audit conclusion, Victor pulled a routine incoming inspection on a new shipment of metoprolol succinate, the active pharmaceutical ingredient at the core of Cardivex. The certificate of analysis looked correct at first glance, but it carried a supplier code he didn't recognize. He cross-referenced it against the approved vendor list the company maintained under its FDA-registered quality agreement, and the code returned no match. He checked the physical container against the reference standard on file, noted a slight variance in the powder's flow characteristics that fell outside the validated specification range, and pulled the full incoming batch record. The approved supplier, a German firm called Kellner Braun, had missed a scheduled shipment 2 weeks earlier due to a port delay. The replacement had come instead from a domestic distributor called Meridian Industrial Supply, whose catalog described itself as serving research, educational, and light industrial customers. Meridian wasn't on Beaumont Herrick's approved vendor list. It had never undergone a supplier qualification audit, and the metoprolol succinate it had shipped carried no independent purity verification from a certified third-party laboratory. The price difference was stark. Kellner Braun's certified API cost approximately $62 per kilogram. Meridian's substitute had been invoiced at $11. Across the full production run for the VHA contract, the substitution had saved the company just under $200,000. Victor placed a formal hold on the entire Cardivex batch, flagged the incoming material for quarantine, and filed a written discrepancy report through the internal quality management system. His shift supervisor, Roy Pinkham, who'd been at the company longer than Victor, and had survived 3 different ownership changes by learning when to make problems disappear, told him quietly that the audit team was arriving in 36 hours, and that the executive floor expected the production log to show a clean release by morning. Victor told him the production log would reflect what the data showed: a batch of cardiac medication manufactured with unqualified raw material that had never been tested for dissolution rate, impurity profile, or bioavailability consistency. He'd been through near misses before, though never under quite this much institutional pressure. Early in his FDA career, he'd reviewed a case where a compounding pharmacy had sourced an unverified API for an anticoagulant, and the resulting product had shown inconsistent potency across units, leading to adverse events that took months to trace back to the raw material. He still remembered the number of patients involved. He still remembered that the root cause had been someone deciding the certified supplier's lead time was inconvenient. He wasn't willing to be the person who made that decision again, under a different name and a different company logo. He photographed the certificate of analysis, logged the Meridian invoice number, documented the batch size, calculated the distribution of the affected material across the production run, and confirmed through the shipping manifest that none of the compromised batch had yet left the facility. Only then did he escalate through the formal channel. Sandra arrived in the quality lab within 20 minutes of being notified that her flagship product had been placed on hold the morning before the VHA procurement officers were scheduled to walk the floor. She was 51, held an MBA from Wharton, and had a reputation in the industry for delivering results her predecessors had consistently failed to produce. She'd rebuilt Beaumont Herrick's revenue from a flat line into a steady upward slope over the 8 years she'd led the company. But she'd spent most of her career in commercial and strategy roles and had never personally managed a manufacturing operation. She understood markets, she understood margins. She was less fluent in what it actually meant when a pharmaceutical chemist said the words, "unvalidated impurity profile." Victor laid out the issue the way he would have explained it to a new analyst on her first week. The approved vendor list existed because the FDA required manufacturers to validate every ingredient source before using it in a drug intended for human consumption. Validation meant purity testing, stability data, manufacturing site audits. Meridian had provided none of it. Without it, there was no way to confirm that the metoprolol succinate in the current batch would dissolve at the rate the product's clinical trials had assumed, reach therapeutic concentration in the blood at the expected time, or remain stable across the shelf life printed on the label. For cardiac patients, specifically the veterans this contract was meant to serve, many of them elderly, many on multiple medications, many relying on precise beta blockade to manage arrhythmia or post-infarction recovery, the difference between a properly validated API and an untested substitute wasn't a paperwork technicality. It was the difference between a drug that worked and a drug that might not. In a patient population where might not could mean a hospital readmission or worse. Sandra didn't ask him to explain it a second time. She asked how much the alternate supplier had charged per kilogram, and when he told her, she turned to Gregory Farrell, the company's chief operating officer who had followed her into the lab, and asked whether Victor's concern was over something the purchasing team had already flagged as a cost-saving measure. Gregory confirmed it was. Sandra told the room that a $200,000 sourcing decision made by a purchasing manager didn't require a senior QA chemist to halt a manufacturing line the morning before an $890 million audit, and that the correct response to a vendor documentation gap was to request the missing paperwork from the supplier, not freeze the entire batch. Victor said the gap wasn't minor, because no amount of retroactively requested paperwork could validate a material that had already been incorporated into finished product without prior qualification. The testing had to happen before manufacturing, not after. Sandra said that was a distinction that existed primarily in the minds of people who had never been responsible for a revenue target. Gregory added, without apparent discomfort, that Victor had a son in college and that his family circumstances were well known to HR. The implication being that a man in his position should understand of not creating problems where flexible solutions existed. Victor answered that a dosage form for cardiac patients didn't have a flexible threshold for active ingredient purity, and that his son's tuition had no bearing on what the pharmacopoeia required. The room went quiet in the particular way. Rooms go quiet when someone says out loud the thing everyone present understands can't be unsaid. Sandra's expression shifted, not to anger exactly, but to the decision to treat his refusal as a personal challenge rather than a professional disagreement. She told him he was being insubordinate. Gregory told him the hold was being lifted by executive authority. Sandra told him his employment was terminated effective immediately, and she said it in front of 4 people who worked for Victor. 2 quality analysts and a lab technician named Marcus Teo, who'd been at the company for 3 years and stood very still near the back wall, saying nothing at all. Victor's badge was deactivated while he was still in the room. The hold notice was removed from the batch record before he'd even signed out his personal equipment. A junior analyst was told to countersign the release documentation in his place, and she did, because she was 26 years old, and no one had ever told her she had the right to refuse a direct instruction from the CEO. Before he left the building, Victor placed the API sample he'd collected in a properly sealed evidence container, logged it with his signature and the time, and submitted his quality discrepancy report through the FDA's MedWatch external reporting portal, rather than through the internal system, which he'd been locked out of the moment his badge was deactivated. The report included the Meridian invoice, the batch number, the certificate of analysis, with its mismatched supplier code, and a summary of the technical concerns he'd documented that morning. Within the hour, Gregory quietly ordered the incoming material hold reclassified in the company's internal records as a resolved documentation discrepancy. The Meridian shipment moved from quarantine back into active stock. The production line for the VHA batch was authorized to resume. Marcus Teo, still at his workstation, noticed that the batch release document now in the system bore a timestamp 15 minutes earlier than the one he remembered seeing before Victor had been removed from the building. He wrote the discrepancy down on a piece of paper and put it in his jacket pocket, not yet sure what he'd do with it. Across the city, Victor sat at the kitchen table in the house. He and Clara had bought the year Nathan was born, an unlocked FDA portal confirmation on his laptop, and a folder of termination paperwork he had no intention of signing in its current form. Nathan called from campus between classes. Victor told him there'd been a disagreement about a quality matter at work. Nathan, 20, and in his second year of a biochemistry program, said quality disagreements at pharmaceutical companies had a way of becoming public very quickly, and asked whether his father was okay. Victor said he was fine. What he meant was that he'd stopped feeling the fear that had gripped him in the parking lot. An hour earlier, the fear of what this meant for Nathan's tuition and the mortgage and the future, and that what had replaced it was quieter and more durable. The certainty that the batch record was wrong, and that somewhere between the manufacturing floor and a VHA hospital pharmacy, a patient was going to receive a cardiac medication made with an ingredient nobody had actually tested. He kept Clara's photograph on the kitchen shelf, directly across from where he sat, and thought about what she would have said if he'd come home that evening and told her he'd signed the release. She'd been a schoolteacher who spent 20 years telling students that the point of knowing the right answer was to give it, even when the room expected something else. He sat with that for a while. Then he opened his laptop and made sure the FDA report had been properly received. Inside Beaumont Herrick, Dr. Karen Whitfield, the company's vice president of pharmaceutical sciences and the person technically responsible for overseeing the quality function Victor had just been removed from, spent the afternoon in a state of controlled unease. She was working hard not to let anyone see. She hadn't been in the lab when Victor was fired. She'd been on the 4th floor reviewing slides with the regulatory affairs team, and by the time she heard what had happened, the batch had already been re-released. She went back to her office and pulled the original validation dossier for Cardivex. On page 47, the section governing API sourcing requirements and the approved vendor protocol, the author credit read, Victor R. Aldren, former regulatory specialist, FDA Office of Pharmaceutical Quality. Karen sat with that for a long time. Sandra had fired the person who had written the sourcing standard the company was now violating. She thought about walking back to Sandra's office and saying so directly. She thought about what Sandra had told her 2 months earlier when she'd raised a concern about the accelerated stability testing timeline. That if Karen's team was going to be the reason Beaumont Herrick missed its biggest contract window in 15 years, Sandra would find a team that understood what was at stake. Karen had 3 people reporting to her whose positions depended on her continued employment. She thought about all of it, and then she closed the dossier and told herself someone else would catch it. 2 days after Victor's termination, the FDA assigned his report to Audrey Nwosu, a senior compliance officer in the agency's Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, who'd spent 12 years conducting pharmaceutical manufacturing inspections, and had a reputation in the industry for being immune to the particular form of executive reassurance that involved catering, prepared presentations, and careful seating arrangements. Audrey's first call was to Sandra's regulatory affairs liaison. Her second was to the VHA procurement office to inform them that a pre-shipment quality hold had been filed and subsequently overridden on the Cardivex batch under review. Her third action was to issue a mandatory inspection notice requiring Beaumont Herrick to halt all distribution on the VHA contract batch until her team could inspect the facility in person. Sandra's communications team had already begun drafting a statement describing Victor as a recently terminated employee with a history of excessive caution who'd filed an inaccurate complaint as a form of professional grievance. The statement went through 4 drafts before Sandra decided not to release it, not because it was untrue in the sense she intended, but because Audrey's inspection notice arrived before the drafts were finished. Audrey arrived at the Beaumont Herrick campus at 7:15 the following Wednesday morning with 2 inspection chemists and a document specialist, and declined Sandra's offer of a lobby tour and coffee service in the executive conference room. She asked instead for the incoming material log for the past 90 days, the full chain of custody records for the VHA Cardivex batch, and the original quality hold documentation her office had been told was a domication discrepancy that had since been resolved. The incoming material log, the batch record, and the hold documentation contained 3 different versions of the supplier information for the metoprolol succinate shipment. The original held the Meridian code, the revised version named Kellner-Braun, the approved German supplier. The batch release showed a 3rd entry that matched neither. Marcus Teo found Audrey's document specialist in the hallway outside the lab and handed over the piece of paper he'd been carrying in his jacket pocket for 2 days, without saying anything beyond his name and job title. Audrey requested that Victor be contacted and invited to return to the facility to walk her team through the original quality finding. Sandra's initial reaction was to call the invitation inappropriate, since Victor was no longer an employee and had filed his report, in her words, in bad faith. Audrey said whether the report had been filed in bad faith was precisely what her team was there to determine, and that she'd make that determination herself. Victor crossed back through the side entrance he'd left through 4 days earlier. Sandra seated him at the far end of the conference table and introduced him to Audrey's team as a former employee recently released from the company, phrasing it in a way meant to suggest instability without quite saying so. Victor placed 2 small vials on the table. One held a sample of the Meridian API. The other held a reference standard of the Kellner-Braun material from the company's own reference library. Under fluorescent light, the 2 powders looked nearly identical. He explained, without raising his voice, where they differed: the validated dissolution profile, the independent purity certification, the particle size distribution testing, the supplier site audit confirming the manufacturing environment met pharmaceutical-grade GMP standards, and the stability data confirming consistent potency across the product's rated shelf life. The Meridian material had documentation for none of it. Its certificate of analysis was a commercial document prepared by the distributor, not a pharmaceutical-grade analytical report. Audrey ordered a full inspection of the warehouse and incoming materials storage. Within 2 hours, her chemists had found 3 additional Meridian shipments received in the prior 90 days, all incorporated into finished product lots currently staged for distribution. The relabeling on 2 of those shipments appeared to have been applied over the original Meridian stickers, and the handwriting on the new labels didn't match any standard receiving form. Joel Stringer, the director of supply chain operations, told the inspection team the Meridian sourcing decision had been made autonomously by a single purchasing coordinator who'd since been reassigned, and that he himself hadn't known about it until that morning. Audrey's document specialist found Joel's email signature on the original Meridian vendor approval, dated 6 weeks before the first shipment arrived. Sandra continued to maintain that no one at the executive level had authorized the substitution or been told of the documentation gap. Audrey opened the original Cardivex validation protocol and asked, in front of the assembled room, who had authored the API sourcing requirements in Section 4.7. Karen answered before she'd fully decided to. Her voice was even, though her hands weren't. The section, she said, had been authored by Victor Aldren based on his regulatory experience prior to joining the company. The silence that followed was the kind that couldn't be filled by further explanation. A junior inspector on Audrey's team, working through the company's archived regulatory files, found a folder created 11 years earlier during Victor's first month at the company. It held the original API qualification protocol he'd submitted to establish the approved vendor framework, and a warning, in plain language, that pharmaceutical-grade APIs for cardiac applications could not be substituted with industrial-grade material without full revalidation, regardless of chemical similarity, because bioavailability performance was a function of manufacturing process as well as chemical composition. He'd written that sentence in his first year with the company, before anyone on the current executive team had arrived. Beaumont Herrick had built its reputation for Cardivex's clinical consistency on a protocol whose author its CEO had just fired. Audrey asked Sandra directly why she'd overridden the hold and terminated Victor on the same morning, if she'd genuinely believed the concern was a minor documentation gap. Sandra said she'd acted on her operational judgment. Audrey said operational judgment was not an FDA-recognized basis for releasing a pharmaceutical batch with unvalidated source material, and that what Sandra had actually known at the time she made that decision was something her team would now need to reconstruct in full. Victor was asked to help the inspection team review the full batch history for all affected lots. He agreed without asking for any written acknowledgement of what had been done to him. As the scope widened, Audrey's chemists found the Meridian material in 4 separate finished product lots totaling just under 300,000 units of Cardivex, destined for VHA hospital pharmacies across 11 states. Not every unit was guaranteed to be clinically ineffective, but without validated source data, not one could be certified as meeting the potency and dissolution specifications the product's prescribing information was based on. For patients managing heart failure, arrhythmia, or post-cardiac event recovery, an underdosed beta blocker doesn't fail obviously. It fails quietly over weeks of subtherapeutic blood pressure control and gradual clinical deterioration a physician might attribute to disease progression rather than product inconsistency. Audrey issued a voluntary recall recommendation for all affected lots. The VHA contract was placed under immediate suspension pending a full quality systems review. The FDA issued a public statement the following morning, and Beaumont Herrick stock declined sharply before the market had been open an hour. Sandra held a company-wide call that afternoon, describing the situation as an isolated vendor substitution the company's normal quality controls had already been addressing when it was prematurely escalated externally. She didn't mention Victor by name. She didn't mention that the external escalation had occurred only after his hold was overridden and he was removed from the building. Word moved through the production floor anyway. A formulation technician who'd worked under Victor's oversight for 6 of his 11 years told a newer colleague that Victor had caught a batching error 2 years earlier on an entirely different product line, caught it early enough that no corrective action beyond rejecting the material and reordering had ever been needed. He'd done it the same way he did everything, quietly, without making it about himself, without needing anyone to thank him for it. That reputation, which had existed beneath a job title most executives never thought to ask about, surfaced now in conversations across every shift. Before the formal regulatory hearing convened, Gregory approached Victor privately in an unused conference room and offered him reinstatement, a raise to $160,000, and a newly created role as Director of Quality Operations, on the condition that he provide a written statement to the VHA consortium characterizing the API substitution as an isolated sourcing error with no systematic quality implications, and confirming that all affected product met clinical specifications based on the company's own internal testing data. Victor asked what would happen to the 300,000 units already staged for distribution. Gregory said, the company intended to implement enhanced post-market surveillance and handle any necessary corrective actions after the contract was executed and the first payment received. Victor told him post-market surveillance on a product with an unvalidated API wasn't a corrective action plan. It was a monitoring program for harm the company had already decided to accept on behalf of patients who'd never consented to it. Gregory said Victor was being unrealistic about how pharmaceutical companies actually operated in competitive environments, and that refusing would change nothing about the product's eventual release. It would only ensure he personally gained nothing from the outcome. Victor said a title and a raise weren't compensation he could accept for telling a federal health agency a cardiac drug was safe when he had no data to support the claim. Gregory pressed further, said the investigations would likely result in significant penalties regardless of what Victor did, and that cooperating with the company's narrative was the fastest way to protect the employees on the production floor, whose jobs depended on the contract staying intact. Victor said the production floor employees hadn't decided to source from an unqualified vendor. The people who had made that decision were the ones responsible for the exposure, and shielding them by misrepresenting the science wasn't protecting anyone on the floor. It was protecting the people at the top by shifting the risk onto the patients at the end of the supply chain. Sandra entered before Gregory had finished pressing the point. She told Victor she understood he was in a difficult position as a single parent, and that she had no interest in destroying his professional future over what she still believed was a difference of regulatory interpretation. The FDA's requirements in this area, she said, involved a degree of flexibility people coming from the agency's enforcement side sometimes failed to appreciate once they were working inside commercial realities. Victor answered that the flexibility she was describing didn't appear anywhere in the regulations he'd helped write, and that his being a single parent had no bearing on the dissolution profile of a beta blocker. Sandra's posture changed. She told him that submitting confidential quality documentation to a regulatory agency without executive authorization was a potential violation of the company's proprietary information agreement, and that she'd have no choice but to pursue that claim if he continued to obstruct the company's remediation efforts. Victor reminded her that the FDA's adverse event reporting system existed specifically to receive documentation of this kind, and that his submission had gone through a legally designated channel to a legally authorized recipient. He had no documentation to obstruct, since the hold he'd placed had already been removed by executive order, and the records he'd submitted were his own contemporaneous notes, not any proprietary company file. Sandra left the room without another word. The exchange had been observed through a glass partition by two members of Audrey's team working in the adjacent space, and Audrey had already been briefed on it before Sandra returned to her own office. When Audrey later asked Victor what he actually wanted from the process, he gave her 3 answers. A full audit of every lot produced with unqualified Meridian material, not just the VHA batch. Formal protection for Marcus Teo and the junior analyst, who'd been pressured into countersigning the release, since neither had been given a real choice. And a public record that reflected the actual approval chain behind the substitution, rather than pinning it on a single purchasing coordinator who'd signed nothing that hadn't first been approved above him. He asked for no financial settlement and no reinstatement. Edmund Cross, the longtime board chairman, convened an emergency session the following morning. The first time in 11 years the board had met outside its regular quarterly schedule. Sandra appeared with legal counsel and a prepared statement, calling the situation a recoverable supply chain incident that management was actively remediating, proposing an enhanced surveillance program supplemented by voluntary batch testing of a representative sample of the affected units. Audrey's team presented first. She laid out the complete timeline without softening any of it. Kellner Braun had missed a delivery. Gregory had proposed the Meridian substitute to Joel Stringer as a temporary gap measure. Joel had processed the vendor approval and placed the order. Karen had sent an internal memo noting the incoming material qualification was incomplete and recommending a hold pending supplier documentation. Sandra had approved continued production on a schedule that left no time for the qualification process to run. Victor had discovered the substitution during routine inspection, documented it fully, and placed a formal hold. Sandra had overridden the hold, fired Victor, and ordered the batch released. The whole documentation had then been altered in the company's system within the hour. Marcus Teo had preserved the original timestamp discrepancy. The failure had shown up exactly where the data said it would, not in a field failure that harmed a patient, but in a federal inspection that stopped it from reaching one. Gregory tried to argue that Sandra hadn't been fully briefed on the technical implications at the time she made her decision. Sandra's counsel objected immediately. Karen's memo, the one recommending a hold pending documentation, had been addressed to Sandra directly and marked read 20 minutes after it was sent. Karen spoke last among the company witnesses. She said she'd stayed silent when she shouldn't have, and that her silence had been a choice she could no longer defend as reasonable. The person who'd actually been right throughout the entire process was the person Sandra had fired on the morning she should have been listening to him. She didn't apologize to the board. She apologized to the 4 people on Audrey's team, writing down everything she said. Edmund asked Sandra to explain, in her own words, why she'd terminated Victor on the spot, rather than escalating the concern internally and addressing the sourcing discrepancy through the company's established corrective action process. Sandra said she'd made a judgment call under significant time pressure and had subsequently been told the concern was overstated. Edmund asked who had told her that. Sandra said it had come from the supply chain team. Gregory's attorney requested a brief recess. Edmund denied it and asked the question again. Sandra had no answer that didn't amount to an admission that she'd understood the concern clearly and chosen the contract timeline over the drug safety protocol. The board members, who'd been largely silent all morning, began looking at one another in a way that suggested the math had become clear to everyone at once. Audrey announced that the Meridian contamination extended beyond the VHA batch to 2 additional product lines. One, a diuretic combination product that had already shipped to 3 regional hospital networks. A full voluntary recall would need to cover all of it, at the company's expense, filed publicly through the FDA's database where every hospital formulary committee in the country would see it. The VHA consortium suspended the contract formally the next morning. The FDA issued a warning letter covering the quality management failures identified during the inspection. Sandra lost the contract she'd once called the defining achievement of her tenure, and within 3 days of the warning letter's publication, 2 regional hospital networks that had been in talks with the company about separate supply agreements quietly declined to schedule further meetings. Edmund asked Sandra to resign. She pushed back, until Gregory surrendered his email archive to the FDA's inspection team and suddenly had far less institutional support than he'd assumed. The board voted to suspend her that afternoon. Joel Stringer was terminated. Gregory was placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the federal review. Within 2 days, both men had retained separate legal counsel. Karen submitted her resignation that same evening in a letter she also shared with Audrey's office. It described, in clinical language, what she'd known when she'd known it and what she'd chosen not to say. She called it not whistleblowing. It was too late for that, but the record she owed the patients she'd failed to protect, while it was still possible to protect them. As the hearing room began to empty, Sandra stopped near the door and turned to Victor with the expression of someone who needed to say something that wouldn't cost her any more than she'd already lost. She asked whether he was satisfied with the outcome. Victor said no one walked away from something like this without cost. 300,000 units of cardiac medication had to be recalled from hospital pharmacies across 11 states. Every one of those vials had to be pulled from a shelf where a patient might have reached for it. That wasn't a victory. It was the minimum correct outcome after a series of decisions that never should have been made. He picked up the Meridian sample from the table. Quietly enough that only Edmund and a few others nearby could hear him, he said the company hadn't lost an $890 million contract because of a vial of uncertified powder. It had lost it because the people responsible for that contract had decided the standard for what goes into a cardiac patient's medication was a variable they could adjust against a quarterly delivery schedule. The silence that followed held longer than anyone in the room seemed comfortable with. Edmund offered Victor the position of Vice President of Quality in the restructuring that followed. Victor declined after thinking about it for 3 days. Replacing one person in an unaccountable senior role with a different person in the same unaccountable role wasn't a quality system, he told Edmund. It was a personnel change. He proposed instead that the company establish an independent quality assurance board reporting directly to the full board of directors, with authority to issue batch holds without executive override, to report directly to the FDA without internal review, to extend formal protection to any employee who raised a documented safety concern, and to publish a summary of all material deviations in the company's quarterly compliance report, rather than resolving them quietly through internal channels. Edmund agreed to all 4 provisions and asked Victor to design the framework and lead the division in whatever role he felt suited the job. Victor said he'd do it from the floor, in the same lab where he'd worked for 11 years. He didn't need an office with a window to do it correctly. The recall took 4 months and cost Beaumont Herrick, a sum its annual report would later describe as material but manageable relative to the alternative. Because the problem had been caught before a single affected unit reached a patient, no adverse events were recorded. No one was harmed. The company confirmed this in its corrective action report to the FDA, and the auditors who reviewed it noted, in language they didn't usually use in regulatory documents, that the outcome was a direct consequence of a quality system that had functioned as intended at the individual level even after it had failed at the institutional one. The VHA contract was permanently withdrawn. The company was permitted to keep supplying its other approved products to non-federal customers once the full corrective action plan had been independently verified, and within 18 months, 2 of the regional hospital networks that had paused discussions quietly reached back out to Edmund's office to ask about the status of the restructured quality framework. Victor walked back through the side entrance 8 months later, wearing the same lab coat he'd always worn. Nathan came to the opening of the new Independent Quality Documentation Center, which the company named after the compliance standard Victor had written in his first year there. A standard that had sat quietly in a regulatory folder for 11 years. Protecting the integrity of a product the company had eventually tried to undermine and failed to undermine, precisely because the protection had been built carefully enough to survive even the people who tried to remove it. Marcos Tio was promoted to Quality Systems Lead and spent the next year training every incoming analyst on what to do when a discrepancy didn't match what the official record claimed. Karen returned to the company in a part-time advisory role 2 years later, after the FDA had cleared Beaumont Herrick's corrective action plan in full. In her first meeting with the new quality team, she said professional silence, however understandable in the moment, was never actually neutral. That the moment she'd closed the validation dossier and told herself someone else would catch it was the moment she'd become part of the problem. She'd convinced herself she was merely observing. Sandra appeared at a pharmaceutical industry governance conference 14 months after her resignation and described, in terms unusually direct for a public forum, the sequence of decisions she'd made and the reasoning behind each one. She didn't call any of them malicious. She called them the product of a mental model in which regulatory requirements were one variable among many to be managed. Rather than a fixed boundary, everything else had to fit inside. She said she'd learned what that model cost only after it had already cost the maximum it was capable of costing. Some in that audience found the admission insufficient. Some found it genuinely instructive. Edmund, sitting in the third row, said afterward that honesty arriving late was still worth more than a consistent story that was never true. New employees at Beaumont Herrick who rotated through the quality lab during orientation often paused at the small display case mounted beside the incoming materials station. Inside it, behind tempered glass, sat the original Meridian Certificate of Analysis, the document Victor had flagged, photographed, and preserved in the minutes before his badge was deactivated. Beneath it, on a narrow strip of brass, was a line the board had asked Victor to choose, and that he'd spent a week thinking about before answering. He'd placed the vial in the case himself without fanfare on a Tuesday morning between two routine incoming inspections, the same way he'd always done every other thing that mattered. The line on the brass plate read, "A drug is not safe because someone decided the timeline could not wait. It is safe because someone decided the patient could not wait."